So, Justin, just thinking about the big picture of how communities find out about what's going on and the state of local news and local journalism, we hear a lot that mainstream local newspapers and so on are in trouble. What's going on?
There's no question that there's no doubt that most local newspapers are experiencing varying degrees of difficulty. So we're seeing a lot of local newspapers, some very famous titles like the Liverpool Post, are closing. We're seeing a pattern in which local dailies are turning to local weeklies. Often, actually, that is the precursor to them being shut down altogether. They're not generating the level of income they used to. The whole business model for local journalism is clearly, it's not in terminal crisis, but it's in trouble. It's not making the kind of money that it used to, and a lot of titles are closing down as a result.
And what's the reason for that?
I think there's a couple of big reasons, and both have to do with the growth of online. One is that there's other sources of information available for online, which is competition that they face, and that's often free. And the other is that advertising is going online. So the kind of advertising revenues that a lot of these local newspapers needed to maintain their profit margins is no longer there. So, I mean, they're often pulling out because they can't generate that kind of income anymore. So advertising is moving online, and some readers are moving online as well. So that both those things have really cut into the profit margins of local newspaper companies.
So, are online services, news services, hyperlocal sites going to replace newspapers, old-fashioned legacy media, or not?
I think if we just left it the way things are, the answer would probably be in some areas, but in other areas, no. The problem is that they're only going to replace it in areas that are, very clearly profitable and that can put in advertising revenue. For a lot of local communities, that's not really going to cut it. So I think we need to think about how we can support and sustain hyperlocal and local journalism to enable the sector to survive in this new environment, because left to its own devices, I think it will be very hit and miss. We've already seen that. We see some hyperlocals doing quite well and other hyperlocals really struggling because there's just not the income there.
So if there isn't the income for traditional local newspapers and there isn't the income for some online hyperlocals and so on, I mean, that's the market saying people don't want that kind of news and information, isn't it? What's the problem?
Well, part of the problem actually is it's funny because when you do surveys about what people want in journalism, one of the things that comes right at the top of the kind of news that people most want is news about their local communities. I mean, people will always say that's one of the types of news they most value. So clearly there's a demand. The question, I suppose, is can you create a way of delivering that to people which is less expensive than it was in the past? What's clear is we don't have that sort of body of advertising revenue anymore to sustain a lot of local journalists in a local area producing that kind of news. So I think the future is about producing it in a way that is that involves the community much more. So you don't just rely on a team of journalists to do it. You rely perhaps on a smaller number of journalists or a part-time journalist to do it in collaboration with the local community.
Or communities can do it for themselves.
Exactly. And communities might want to do it for themselves, and who knows? They might get to a point where they are able to raise enough revenue to employ somebody on a part-time basis that provides the kind of core to what they do. But they're not going to be able to raise enough money to employ sort of 4 or 5 journalists in a local area in the way in which we might have seen in the past.
So why does this matter? Why, if communities don't know what's going on or have no kind of means of communication between different parts of the community and all the rest of it, why does it matter?
Well, it is the bedrock of local democracy, isn't it? I mean, if you don't know what's going on in your local area, how are you supposed to make a meaningful decision about, what your council should be doing or who should be on the council or any of those kinds of things? I mean, we have a lot of local democracy in this country. If we don't have local information sources as well, there's not much point in having local democracy. Otherwise, you've just got a list of names, you don't know anything about them or what they stand for. You might as well just, throw a coin in the air and decide who to vote for. Without that kind of information, and it's not just about voting either. It's about, if something happens in a local area that, local people feel strongly about, they need to perhaps get together and do something about it. And that's only going to happen if we know about it. So I think it's absolutely vital. People often get most passionate about issues that are local to them. and that's only going to happen if people know about them.
Are there examples of those problems manifesting themselves? If we're seeing the kind of collapse of local newspapers in some areas and the hyperlocal sector is at the very early stages of development, is there a gap there at the moment, and are we seeing signs of that?
Yeah, no, I think we are. I mean, there's a research project going on right now in Port Talbot, which was an area that used to have local newspapers that served it well, and we've actually been tracking the information that used to be available and now isn't. And one of the things that's clear is that information about what the council is doing, released by somebody other than the council, i.e. impartial information about what they're doing, just isn't available anymore. And that's pretty important stuff. Knowing who's spending your money on your behalf and what they're spending on, how they're spending it, that's pretty important stuff. And we now know that that's information that in some areas just doesn't exist.
To what extent do the community journalism sites and hyperlocals that are developing actually engage in that sort of accountability journalism at a local level? Or to what extent are they just talking about the school fete or the local sports team?
Well, to be honest, it's a mix. People want a mix. I mean, they don't want it all to be news about what the council are up to. They want a bit of that when it's about things that are important that matter to them. But they also do want to know about what's going on, and it might be, what local people are up to. It might be about local fates, all of those things. You need a mix of both, but there's clearly a demand for something that provides that kind of mix.
So just to tie this up, what are the signs that you see of how a hyperlocal sector might succeed where local newspapers have started to fail?
I think the key to this is that what a new model of hyperlocal journalism offers is perhaps a more meaningful partnership between journalists and the community than local newspapers have offered in the past. And partly that's a necessity, because without people in the community providing information for you in a form that you can use, I don't think any of this is going to be viable. So it relies on communities to some extent doing this for themselves. And I think in some ways that's a problem, but in other ways actually it's an opportunity for us to redefine what local news is. To redefine what the news agenda is. So I think there's some reasons for optimism here too if we seize that opportunity.
Well, just to pick up on that finally, I mean, to redefine what news is, because people can get hung up on journalism with a capital J or news with a capital N because it's been defined by traditional media in a certain way around news values and so on as well. But what you're saying is actually a community can decide for itself what's important and what kind of small J journalism he wants to engage with.
Absolutely right. And of course you wouldn't ignore what makes a good story either, because you want people to read this and be engaged in it. But at the same time, you might have a slightly different set of priorities than the priorities that a traditional journalist might have.
Great. Thanks very much.